Well, I guess I'll start.
Okay.
People filter in, they filter in. You two already know who I am. I'm Michael Kavka, otherwise known as Shecky. I've been in the field for around 7 years professionally, full-time. I started off in IT about 25 years ago, and I was doing IT well before I started doing it as a living job. I help organize Chicago's, one of Chicago's Burbsecs. I'm officially the organizer for Burbsec North. I'll help out with some of the other Burbsecs as needed, as we all tend to flip and float around with the decentralized systems. Whoops, wrong button. I also am a Hack for Kids volunteer. Love working with the kids, love seeing them go ahead and come up through everything, and that aha moment when they're doing something, especially this last one that we had up in Milwaukee, where somebody took apart in the destruction village something, but so that's how that works. There's my website. I blog rather infrequently. I keep saying I'm going to do it more frequently, and I get into about a month and a half, 2 month time frame where I'm blogging regularly, and then it just sort of drifts off to the side. Yeah. Where you could really find me hanging out is on the Twitterverse. I do a lot of tweeting and a lot of retweets out there. So what we're going to talk about today is what defense in depth is and how it goes in a different way sometimes than you might originally think. The basic idea, it's what is it? We know that it's the idea of using multiple layers to increase security. It's not something that's new. It's something that's gone on back to prehistoric times of building moats around castles, and before that building the sand rock around it, or finding a spot where you had better defense because you were up higher and you had trees and then you had natural water in front of you, just to be able to give yourself a better defensive position. Today's talk is going to focus more on multiple vendors as a type of defense in depth. And I'm going to be showing this through an actual real world scenario that I went through last year and the year before, last year for the most part. It started the year before that. During COVID times, with a couple of simple questions as to why things were the way they were. Graphics! Yes, we have graphics. I hate doing slide decks. I hate slides. But what we see here is typically what you think of as defense in depth. You have your data, application, your host, your internal network, your rings going on down through all the way on to the point of what you're protecting, what's getting protected by what, where it's going, and where your layers are sitting. And what you need is that border in between each of the layers for each of the defense. So theoretically, your data is supposed to be the most secure thing that you've got going on out, because you've got to get through more stuff. And I say theoretically because we know that's not true. But that's the basic idea behind defense in depth. We tend to, it doesn't give a depth to the idea. So what you're seeing is just basic layout. We tend to skip or lighten beyond areas in that, and a lot of times it's due to lack of resources, maybe sometimes lack of budget. In this day and age, with how much we're spending on it, I doubt budget really falls into it as much as resources do.
Which is still budget.
There's still budget, but the budget winds up being more on hiring the right people or getting somebody into the position that they need to get into, as opposed to buying a blinky box. Everybody likes to go ahead and buy a blinking box. But I think the key thing that we have to take away from all of this is layers. Just like onions, they have layers. Just like ogres have layers. Now, I know you might not like ogres or onions. You might prefer a cake or a parfait. But layers are what we need to talk about. And it isn't always so easy, and it still isn't. We have to think about layering within the layers. So if you've got a section of cake, you can layer inside of that section of cake. You can't layer inside of a section of onion, it's a whole thing, but you can layer inside of sections inside of the world that we live in. You could call it sub-layering, some people have done that. People try and do it with the same product, and it doesn't work the same way. You really, to go ahead and do that sort of sub-layering, need multiple products that work together and don't work against each other. And we've all seen back in the day the Symantec versus McAfee situation where people would toss 2 antiviruses on their machine and their machine would become unusable because all the resources were eaten up. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, and they're a lot better, the vendors out there are a lot better about it, is actually integrating to a point where you can use stuff that do a similar type thing, but for one it's a primary, for one it's a secondary, but that backup there can be very, very different. Now, that's not to say that the interference between products doesn't happen anymore. It does. In the same breath, it doesn't happen quite as frequently. We all know the situation. You're out on the net, it came from the net, you've got your web blocking software in there, you've got your antivirus on your machine, everything's there. You go to a website and it was blocked. I ran into this situation last year where a site known as mail.ru, you can go ahead and look it up there, and its subdomains were being alerted on by Microsoft security tools in a bunch of machines, and by Cisco Umbrella on other machines. And it was driving my bosses completely crazy. What software is not working and why is it not working the same across the whole environment? We've got Microsoft Defender blocking, we've got Umbrella blocking. Umbrella should theoretically, from what we understood, because it's DNS based and everything, should have been blocking everything beforehand. Well, we'll get to why that didn't happen as we talk along. Yeah. This was, our first thought was why? What? What's going on here? Both technologies did the blocks, but there needed to be a reason why one was chosen over the other. And Mail.ru overall, especially at the time, I found, like other generic sites like Yahoo, like even nowadays there's what's happening with stuff on AWS or Azure, has both good and bad things on it. Mail.ru has legitimate purposes for email addresses and other stuff, but it's been known at times for hosting a lot of malware and for hosting a lot of C2 content. So some threat feeds rated high and some don't rate it so high. So I went, aha, there's got to be the first problem there. It's just the threat feed rating. Well, sort of, but not quite. What you find out was there were more layers inside of it. It was not just because of the technology themselves, but it's the actual layering of the technologies that we ran into. You have multiple pieces of tech that can have similar results, but do you know where they're actually hitting and where they're actually working inside of the whole process? So what's going first, what's going second, what's going third? And you say, well, what would that matter? In forensics, that completely matters. Should that breach happen, you need to go ahead and know where did the breach actually occur? Why did this one fail? And where was this in the order of things that they were able to bypass it? So, the tech in play. Over here you'll see the typical screen from mail.ru on Cisco Umbrella. And over here, Kathy knows this very well, is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Now, you'll notice right now that there's this block list in there, and this says custom indicator. After everything was said and done, when I'd done my research on mail.ru, I went ahead and said, I don't care what the other threat feeds are. We know we don't have any use for mail.ru in our organization. I put in a block into both of them, so that way, should it come off the threat feed, which it very well could, because VirusTotal said, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
it was Alien Vault that said, oh yeah, all this stuff has happened with it. And I said, yeah, we don't need it. Let's just put a block list in there. That didn't change the fact that we were still only getting some machines hitting it with Cisco Umbrella and some machines with Microsoft Defender. We decided it was in our best interest to make it done. So what we wound up with here is, this is the key word there, network filter lookup service. That was the start of where I started looking at things when I finally figured it out. So we've got Cisco Umbrella, we've got Microsoft Exploit Guard, which is what this network filter is. And during my testing, I also wound up going ahead and hitting up on uBlock Origin, which we went across, which was not blocking the site because it's not an ad site per se, or if it was blocking stuff, it was only the ads that were being blocked off of it that were escaping everything else. So why did it need to be manual blocked list in Umbrella? And the reason I say that was because originally Umbrella was not blocking it at all. It was not coming back as malicious or anything. It's mail.ru. You would think with Cisco's Talos, Threat Intel, etc., they would at least put some sort of warning on it, but it wasn't hitting any of the block categories. It's Microsoft's Threat Intel initially was going ahead and saying, yes, this is a bad thing, we are blocking it. So the first time that I ever saw any block from mail.ru was through Microsoft, which led to the question initially of why isn't Cisco blocking this? Microsoft was going ahead and doing things through their things. Umbrella itself is interesting because it only blocks from its own block list, from its own categorizations. So it doesn't do any proactive stuff. It needs to go into one of those categories. Or it's dumped into initially the newly seen domains if it's never been seen out there, which is a whole nother mess in its own right. Now we had some machines getting a block message from Umbrella and others getting blocked by Microsoft. It was an Edge. If it was Edge in Microsoft, you would get their smart screen. Flat out. It would. I'm sure some of you have seen what the smart screen is. It's a big red screen that comes up and says, sorry, we're not allowing this through. In the same breath, what was driving my bosses crazy was the fact that most people don't use Edge. They were using Chrome, and they were using Firefox, more Chrome than anything else. And on either of those two, all you would get is a white page with, up in the left-hand corner, it's saying, access denied. No reason, no nothing. So this keeps going ahead and driving my bosses crazier. And I'm going, I'm sure this is the way that it works, but you really want me to dig into this more? I will dig into it more. So I decided it had to have been an order problem. Security is knowledge, knowing what should be doing what. If you do not know what your products, what your stuff that you're using for security does, you're dead in the water. Somebody needs to know the order and has to have that documented for everybody. Whether it be for a SOC analyst, so that way they can make the right call on whether it needs to go up, or for a forensics person, when you get breached, to go ahead and backtrack where the breach actually occurred. It all needs to be done. So I started doing tests to figure out the reasoning why one tech was happening over the other. And in this case, it was timing of running into this problem that made my life easier, because it made me learn a bit more about the two technologies in play. During my test, I'll say flat out, uBlock Origin would be the first thing to block. But that was only in the case of what was in its block list. It does its thing well, it blocks ads, that's that. So I was able to go ahead and just say, well, it's not blocking it because it's not in the uOrigin block list. Easy enough, but did find out by testing other sites that yes, uBlock Origin would hit first. What happens with Umbrella is Umbrella itself is actually it was formerly OpenDNS. It allows successful DNS lookups before blocking, and it uses its own intel to categorize sites. What happens with Umbrella is that it actually would be called a machine-in-the-middle protection. Just like a machine-in-the-middle attack. It sits there in between everything. And it's evident that that happens when the root certificate expires or doesn't get installed properly, because then all of a sudden you can't get to any site whatsoever because Umbrella's certificate has been rewriting whatever certificate's out there, and your computer goes ahead and says, not happening. It also means that you get a DNS lookup before any sort of blocking happens. And I confirmed this with Umbrella's people themselves when I was going through this. I'm going, well, why are we showing that? Well, it's got to hit DNS before it can go ahead and be blocked this way. So it allowed me to understand why inside of the Umbrella interface I was seeing allowed for DNS. But then I wasn't seeing anything else beyond that on the machines that were being blocked by Microsoft. And I was using machines that I had. I was using a virtual machine and my own laptop to do all this testing with. And it just kept on going like that. And the second I put it in the block list, I was still going ahead and getting a discrepancy. So it still didn't make complete sense to me. Microsoft Network Protection. We all know how much we love to hate on Microsoft. Microsoft hate is really misplaced in this day and age. A lot of it stemmed from a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and fear of Microsoft itself, and not being able to see into certain things. Microsoft Network Protection is part of exploit. It's part of their exploit guard system. It's turned off by default. So you do not have Microsoft Network Protection turned on without turning it on a secondary way. Machine coming straight out of the box and plugged into a network is not going to have Microsoft Network Protection on it. It is enabled through either group policy or Intune, so you can very easily enable it without having to touch any machine. This is also a very key factor in what wound up happening, and we'll get to that as we move onward. Exploit Guard itself is part of Microsoft's Attack Surface Reduction, or ASR, rules. ASR, you've heard, I'm sure, pen testers complain about ASR because it makes their life more difficult. Again, Microsoft is trying to do things right, and they're coming up with some good technologies out there. It all uses Microsoft's threat until whatever their magic sauce in the background is, which I know hits up on other stuff, and they just bought Risk IQ to help with their threat, to make their threat until even better. Network protection does give that smart screen message if you're using the Edge browser. So figured out why it was hitting on the Edge, what was going on with the Edge browser. It was hitting that network protection. And there's the other thing that I found, which was just that access denied on non-Microsoft browsers. If I tested on mail.ru that for some odd reason did not have network protection turned on, I got the Umbrella block screen. Real nice and simple. It came up and it showed if that. If I did it on a Microsoft on a machine that I could see that Microsoft Network Protection was on, Network Protection blocked it. And I would get an alert in the back end on MDE, and everybody would start going, why are we getting this alert? And it alerts. And when you've got a couple of people that are going to sites that just happen to have mail.ru ads on them that are not blocked by uBlock origin, it alerts frequently. And we still get those alerts because network protection is blocking. So the reasoning behind uBlock's position, which was the initial thing that would block stuff, was that it compares the URL entered against its blacklist before the network traffic is even looked at. It just looks at the name that's sitting there, and it's right inside the browser anyway, so it's the fastest and shortest path. Very simple. very easy. Microsoft's protection works similar in the sense that it runs off of a pure IP or DNS response before you actually do a full lookup. When the second that it sees an IP address when you go to do DNS is when it hits, before it goes to look at any categories or anything like that. So it's looking at a block list in the threat intel on its own end, but it hits before any sort of web blocking categorization. It says there's always some network traffic involved in it. Finally was Cisco. Cisco was the third layer in it. So if the other two are not working, then Cisco hits on it. So it starts to make sense, and I turn around and I tell my bosses that this is what's happening. And the more I thought about it, it's, well, that's an ingenious way of looking at it. I now have 3 technologies there, and one of the 3 should block, between the 3 of them, they should block almost all the majority of the bad things out there for the end user. And based off of that, I should be able to tell by what is hitting and what is not hitting what's going on. Well, the question is why was the group policy not being applied to everywhere? Well, it turned out at that point in time, we had not finished getting all the ASR rules rolled out. The machines that were actually getting the Microsoft block were machines that were using the on-prem domain. So it was being pushed out through GPO, and when I went into Intune, they hadn't set it up yet. So all of our, and now we are dealing with COVID, so the majority of people are either home or they're going in through a VDI computer. So those that were on VDI were getting hit by Microsoft and were getting the alert through Microsoft. And if you were on your home laptop, unless you were on using Microsoft Edge and its smart screen, which uses the same technology, you were able to get through to the umbrella block screen on it all. So what I found out and figured out after all this time was that the defense in depth actually does work. It was a proof of concept that I never really thought I would see, because everybody talks about, yeah, you need all these multiple layers, but when you actually see it work in such a fashion, you start to understand where it comes through. What bugs me still is that the DNS lookup is allowed through Umbrella, with everything that Umbrella touts that it can do to allow a full back and forth connection to say, okay, yes, here's this, here's the DNS request, and we're going to give you this information, and then we're going to block you. Doesn't seem like that's the right way to do it, but I'm not a designer. But the more layers that you've got, the more complicated it becomes when you have to backtrack on everything. So the best way of figuring out where your layers are sitting is usually to ask your vendor itself, what's going on? Do a little bit of research. Understand how the technology works. Because the second you understand how that technology works, you go, okay, so Umbrella takes the XYZ, it does a DNS lookup, it comes back, and then it checks against a blacklist. Great. Microsoft Network Protection goes ahead and checks immediately the second that you go there, and it adjusts, changes DNS to IP before it ever comes back to you and says, oh, this is bad. That's the way that it does it. It's layers upon layers upon layers. There are general layers. Big outer rings, the moat around the boat, the firewall sitting in front of your internet, your internal network. There are sublayers. Your IPS, IDS, email protection systems. There are sublayers inside of sublayers. The layers themselves can be differing technologies. Network protection versus web content filtering versus ad blocking. But all 3 of those wind up overlapping to some degree. The idea on it all is to have each of the layers complement each other instead of working against each other. And we've seen at times where things can go ahead and work against each other. A lot of it has to do with secret sauces. A lot of it has to do with improper implementations, misconfigurations. Again, all stuff that can be, most of that stuff can be easily avoided with a little bit of knowledge behind what behind what the technology is doing. And I sort of lied, there can be only one. But the one is the order of the technology and not just a single blinky box. You can have multiple blinky boxes lined up in front of multiple software things and software put in between each of those blinky boxes. If you don't know where you're going with all of that, if you don't design it out properly or understand how it's all working together, what good is it really going to do you? Yeah, it might go ahead and keep you protected for some point, but we all know that any sort of protection can be bypassed eventually. There is no perfect protection. There is no perfect solution. Kathy said it best, and I've been saying the same thing as you did for years. Security is a journey, it's not an endpoint. And we're constantly having to change it. In fact, I've gotten to the point where I dislike telling people that they need better security. I tell them they need better risk management, because that's really in the end what we are doing, is managing the risk level down to something that's more acceptable and easy to deal with, as opposed to being able to lock everything out. If there was perfect security, half the wars that we've had over the years, not just in the 20th century, but going way back to ancient times, probably wouldn't have happened, because they would have figured out how to block it, and that could have gone ahead and gone forward in time to go into the world of technology, just like social engineering has been the same over, and anything else gets brought over into technology. So, it's a matter of working together in the end. Technology companies tend to keep a lot secret from us. Going through and just figuring this out took me a couple of months, because we put in initially a request with Cisco, a support ticket with Cisco about it, and they came back to us with, yeah, DNS should be allowed through like that. Yeah, everything's working as intended. That didn't help me out all that much, outside of letting me know that DNS would never get blocked. The end result was that we were in the midst of rolling out Exploit Guard all across the company. It was part of a initiative that we were doing to try and cut down on the chances of us getting hit by ransomware. An initiative set up by the CEO of the company, because at the time you had all the big name ransomware stuff that was going out and going around. Everything was working as intended. There was no issue, which was my boss's biggest concern. My CISO's biggest concern was that something was not working the way that it was supposed to be working. But with better and simpler documentation on all the products, so that we could see what their interoperability would be, or lack thereof, we would have come to this conclusion a lot faster. We can design and implement better defenses with that same sort of idea. Simpler documentation, better training materials out there, not as much FUD. It all comes in together. C-Tech astronomy is prevalent in our tools. How many people here know what C-Tech astronomy is? How many people here have ever seen the movie Sneakers? How many people now remember what C-Tech astronomy is? No more secrets.
Oh.
It's prevalent in our field. It does hinder us. It does help us in some ways. It's understandable because companies want to go ahead and have an advantage over their competitors. But if they really want to be part of the information security field and not just an information security vendor, they need to find ways of sharing more information out with us. because the people that wind up paying for it in the end are us on the front lines. And with that, I'll take questions. It's not goodbye, it's I'll see you later. Any questions? Feel free to hit me up on Twitter if you ever want to.
How did your boss, like, once you figured it out and you sat down and explained it to them, like, what was their reaction?
Angry at Cisco because they didn't realize the way that Cisco Umbrella was actually working. Grateful that we had the multiple layers in it all. A new understanding said, okay, now we know if it gets past Cisco, it's gotten past A and B also.
Yep.
So we could go ahead and tune stuff up a little bit better and make some detection technologies to go ahead and help out with that. I mean, as you saw in the one slide, it's now a custom detection inside of Microsoft
Right.
Defender. I wrote up the detection myself. Put that in myself, and I have custom detections inside. Some of it based off of that, some of it based off of other things I've seen run and go through. Just so that way, something's going to get through, but the odds of it not being detected start to go down. And detection is going to be the key going forward for any of them. But yeah, he took it with a, thank you, Michael, thank you for all of your hard work. I'm not happy with Cisco about this. But Microsoft's web blocking technology is not anywhere, their categorization, everything's not anywhere near where Cisco's is right now.
Yep.
And I don't see us switching over to something like Zscaler or Blue Coat. I'd worked with Blue Coat at a prior company and it was fantastic. And especially on the newly seen domains situation where I could contact them and have something cleared within a couple hours, whereas with Cisco Umbrella, I turn around and I have to put in the site into an actual whitelist, which we forget about for months on end, and then have to go back through and try and clean up the whitelist. And then it starts all over again. So when you've got a section designing websites for your clients and everything, you run into newly seen domains all the time. Any other questions? No? I'll give you back the extra 10 minutes here.
All right.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you all for attending.